Almost every nuance of your appearance and behavior gives other people tidbits of information that can affect their impressions of you. In fact, when you're in the presence of other people, you can't help but to give off cues about what you're like. Of course, a good deal of the time, you go through your everyday life without thinking much about how other people might be perceiving and evaluating you. Other people might certainly be forming impressions of you, but you aren't actively trying to manage those impressions. But sometimes, when you think that your impressions matter in some way, you may behave in particular ways to make some desired impression. And that's when things get really interesting. As I said, people can form impressions of us based on any observable aspect of our appearance or behavior. So that means we can use any and all of those channels to try to manage our impressions. In this lecture, we're going to look at the variety of ways we try to control how people perceive us, the tactics that we use when attempting to manage our impressions. We're going to start with physical appearance, because that's one channel of information that's always turned on whenever we're in the presence of other people. We use our appearance to manage our impressions in two distinct ways: by trying to enhance our general level of attractiveness, and by using our appearance to try to convey specific impressions of who we are and what we're like in particular situations. Let's talk about general attractiveness first. Very few of us look exactly the way we'd like to look, but most of us try to make the best of what we have. We might not necessarily be attractive, but we'll usually do what we can to not be unattractive. But why? As the old saying goes, beauty is only skin deep. So aren't we being superficial or vain or insecure when we focus on our appearance? Perhaps. But often we try to enhance our physical appearance because we think it makes a difference in how other people perceive and treat us. And sometimes we're right. Even though beauty is only skin deep, research in social psychology shows that other people do draw inferences about us based on our physical appearance alone. For example, studies have found that people automatically assume that more attractive people possess more positive personal characteristics than less attractive people do. Attractive people are rated as more intelligent, sociable, socially skilled, and well-adjusted than less attractive people are. It's not necessarily that less attractive people are viewed unfavorably. They're simply rated less favorably on all sorts of dimensions than attractive people are. Incidentally, research also shows that none of these stereotypes are true. Physically attractive people are not actually more likely to possess these positive characteristics. But people think they do. So most of us want to look reasonably good with whatever body and face we have. When it comes down to it, virtually anything you do to affect your physical appearance is a self-presentational tactic. Why do you get your hair cut? Well, sometimes maybe it's too long and hard to manage. But that's usually not the reason. If it was, you'd simply get the scissors out and cut it off without worrying about what it looked like. No, you usually get your hair cut because you think you'll look better. Have you ever colored your hair? Either because it was getting gray or just because you wanted a different hair color? Self-presentation. Have you ever tried to lose weight? Why? Sometimes people lose weight for health reasons, but most of the time, when people go on a diet, they're trying to be more attractive. Do you exercise? People exercise for lots of reasons, but one important reason is to look better. Have you ever used skincare products to improve your complexion, or decrease wrinkles, or lighten the bags under your eyes? Do you use makeup to give your skin a healthier color, hide imperfections, or enhance your face in some other way? Self-presentation, all of them. Have you had any kind of cosmetic surgery to change features of your face or other parts of your body? About 18 million people have some sort of cosmetic surgery in the United States every year. Plastic surgeons make their livings as impression management technicians. Every now and then, I run into somebody who swears to me that they don't care in the least about what other people think of them. Not at all. But every one of those people do at least some of the kinds of things I've mentioned to enhance their appearance. On top of whatever we might do to affect the appearance of our face and body, our clothing choices are often self-presentational tactics. Except for Halloween, have you ever bought clothes to make you look worse than you usually do? Of course not. We buy clothes that we think will help us make a better impression. And our clothing choices can also convey other cues that affect people's impressions of us. You make a very different impression dressed in business clothes than in a t-shirt and worn-out jeans. You make a different impression if your clothes fit well than if they're either way too tight or way too loose and falling off you. You may make a different impression if you're wearing athletic shoes versus sandals versus cowboy boots. And if you ever iron your clothes, why? Clothes work just fine even with all those wrinkles. And our clothing also tells other people about the role we're in at the time. It's as if certain roles have certain dress codes, and whether you abide by those dress codes affects other people's impressions of you. Imagine going to meet with a banker or lawyer, and they came in dressed like they're ready to play tennis or go to the beach. What they're wearing doesn't really matter, right? They can still give you good financial or legal advice, even if they're dressed in pajamas or a clown costume. But certain roles call for certain clothing, so people manage their impressions by wearing the proper clothes for the role. Of course, some people try to foster certain impressions by purposefully not wearing the sorts of clothes that social norms require. I'm not talking about people who are indifferent to what they wear. Those people aren't trying to manage their impressions one way or the other. I'm talking about people who wear unusual or inappropriate clothing because they want to convey the image of being someone who doesn't care about social rules. Such people are still impression managing, but in a way that signals nonconformity, because that's the impression they want to give other people. People also manage their impressions with their nonverbal behavior, their facial expressions, their gestures and bodily movements. Of course, our nonverbal behaviors are often just spontaneous expressions of what we're thinking or feeling. But we also manage our nonverbal behaviors for self-presentational reasons. Without saying a word, you can convey a great deal of information about yourself nonverbally. Facial expressions are particularly important self-presentational tactics. Do you ever try to give someone the impression that you're more interested in what they're saying than you really are? We all know that it's rude and off-putting to appear disinterested or bored when other people are talking, and it certainly doesn't make a very good impression. So we sometimes manage our facial expressions to present an impression of interest, perhaps accompanied by utterances such as uh-huh, ha, and interesting, to further give the impression that we care. I know for a fact that students engage in self-presentations of attentive interest with their professors. I've seen it in my own classes. Employees do it with their bosses. Parents do it when their little kids babble on and on. Friends and romantic partners do it with each other. And we may even manage an impression of interest, at least for a while, with a stranger who insists on telling us about something that we don't really care about. Likewise, we sometimes manage our emotional expressions for self-presentational purposes. Usually we think of emotional expressions as spontaneous indications that people are experiencing some emotion, and often they are. Sometimes people who are happy or angry or sad just naturally look happy, angry, or sad. but you have almost certainly managed your emotional expressions to give other people the impression that you were feeling, or maybe the impression you were not feeling, some particular emotion. In some cases, you may have actually been experiencing the emotion, and you wanted to be sure that other people were aware of how you felt. Our emotions don't always show up on our faces, so we sometimes have to advertise them a little. Maybe you wanted to be sure that someone knew how happy or angry or upset you were, so you managed your facial expressions to be sure that they picked up on it. I also suspect that you've expressed emotions that you weren't actually experiencing at all, or have hidden some emotions that you were feeling. So you managed your impression to express more happiness than you actually felt, or you hid your annoyance at something that somebody said. Along those lines, people use smiling for self-presentational purposes a lot. Of course, sometimes we smile because we're actually happy about something. But sometimes we smile to convey an impression of friendliness or happiness, or that we're a good sport. A happy, smiling expression usually makes a better impression than a sad or angry one. So far, I've been describing self-presentational tactics that don't require people to say anything. Tactics in which people manage their impressions through their appearance or clothing or nonverbal behavior. But in most instances, the most direct and least ambiguous way to convey an impression of yourself is simply to say things about yourself. So we tell people about our characteristics, about our likes and dislikes, about our attitudes, about our personal experiences, our health problems, our interests and hobbies, our successes and failures, and so on. Not every self-disclosure is self-presentational. We might tell people things about ourselves for reasons that have nothing to do with wanting to make an impression. If your doctor asks you how much sleep you've been getting lately, or a stranger sitting beside you on an airplane asks if you have kids, your answer is probably not self-presentational. You're just providing information about yourself with no intention to make a particular impression. But many of the things we say about ourselves are intended to make an impression. In the course of your daily interactions, you have lots and lots of things that you could say about yourself. But you disclose only certain things at certain times and to certain people. Why? Why do you choose to disclose the things that you do? And why are you selective in who you disclose them to? Of course, what you say about yourself has to be appropriate to the current situation. But even then, you make choices regarding what to say about yourself and whether to say anything at all. And those choices are partly affected by the impressions that you'd like other people to have of you. So, sometimes you express your opinion about some political issue, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you tell that funny but embarrassing story about yourself, but usually you don't bring it up. Occasionally you talk about some interest or hobby you have, but often you don't say anything. Sometimes you mention that special accomplishment or achievement, but other times you don't, even when it's relevant. And now and then you tell people about your background or upbringing or other experiences, but often you don't. Why did you choose to disclose the information that you did? And why did you not disclose other things? Running through all of these choices is an undercurrent of impression management. Explicitly disclosing information about yourself is often the most direct self-presentational tactic, but it's not necessarily the most appropriate or effective. For one thing, norms often discourage us from saying positive things about ourselves. So even if people believe you when you tell them that you're a generous person, or intelligent, or adventuresome, making such blatant claims might violate social norms. Not only that, but talk is cheap, and listeners are often skeptical when people make explicit statements about what they're like. We can't necessarily believe what people say about themselves. So people often use a less direct and somewhat safer self-presentational tactic to convey information about their personal characteristics. Instead of describing themselves to other people, they talk about things that convey information about what they're like indirectly. For example, simply recounting a personal experience can convey a lot of information and create an impression. Oh, that reminds me of the time I was hiking alone in the mountains of Montana. That single sentence conveys lots of information about what you're like without making any explicit claims about being an outdoorsy person, or a hiker, or liking to be alone sometimes, or having the confidence to head off into the mountains by yourself. Expressing attitudes can do the same thing. The attitudes we hold about almost anything can convey information from which other people draw inferences about us. So expressing an attitude or hiding it can serve a self-presentational function. Of course, telling personal stories or expressing your attitudes can just be fodder for conversation, with no self-presentational goal whatsoever. But sometimes people talk about particular experiences, opinions, ideas, and reactions to intentionally convey certain impressions of themselves. Most people think of self-presentation as sort of window dressing, something we add on to our behavior to make some impression we want to make. And sometimes that's exactly what it is. But often we behave in certain ways just to make an impression. In these cases, self-presentation isn't window dressing hung on top of some behavior. It's the behavior itself. People do a lot of things to convey impressions of themselves to other people. This theme will come up again and again during the course. But for now, let me give you just 2 examples to show how people use everyday behaviors for self-presentational purposes. The first involves eating. Now, normally we think of eating as a way to get nourishment, or maybe as a way to have a pleasant social event with other people. But other people form impressions of us based on what we eat, how much we eat, the way we eat. So self-presentational motives can influence our eating. And sometimes people use eating as a self-presentational tactic. When having dinner with other people, have you ever held back from eating something? Maybe that second piece of pie, because you didn't want to look like a glutton? Or did you ever try some new, really weird food someone offered, even though you didn't want to, because you didn't want to look squeamish? Have you ever hidden the fact that you ate something, maybe sneaking into the kitchen to get a snack, hoping that no one else would see you? Do you use the same table manners when you're with other people as you do when you eat alone at home? These are admittedly trivial kinds of behaviors, but they show how self-presentational concerns can infuse such a common, everyday behavior as eating. One particularly interesting study of the self-presentational use of eating showed that college women ate less when eating with a man they had just met if he had been described in a socially desirable fashion than in a less desirable fashion. They ate less if they were told that the man was interested in traveling, photography, athletics, and reading, and was planning to go to law school, than if they thought his hobbies were watching TV and going to parties, and he didn't have any career goals. But why would the man's desirability affect how much the women ate? The researchers suggested that the women ate less with the more desirable guy because they were motivated to make a good impression on him. We know from other research that people form more positive impressions of a woman who eats lightly than a woman who eats a lot. And the women in the study seem to realize that. The women who ate with the less desirable guy ate whatever they wanted because they weren't as concerned with making a good impression. Of course, this effect may be specific to cultures in which norms specify that women should eat lightly. Nevertheless, it shows that people will use a behavior as mundane as eating for self-presentational reasons when they think it might pay off. A second example of a behavioral self-presentational tactic involves people displaying or hiding their connections to other people. Everyone's heard the old saying, "A man is known by the company he keeps." And of course that applies to women as well. And it's true. People sometimes form impressions of us based on the people we're associated with. Given that's the case, people can influence others' impressions of them by touting their connections to certain people, particularly people who are successful, powerful, attractive, or famous. This self-presentational tactic is known as basking in reflected glory. And its most common form is probably name-dropping. We've all heard people mention their connections to some well-known or exemplary person. Maybe you've done it yourself. Another way that people bask in reflected glory is to wear clothing that mentions successful sports teams. Research shows that sports fans are significantly more likely to wear apparel that identifies their team after their team wins than after it loses. And they're more likely to wear apparel that identifies their team the larger the team's margin of victory. In addition, people are more likely to bask in the reflected glory of a team's success when they think other people have an unfavorable impression of them, suggesting that they're doing it for self-presentational reasons. In the same way, people who put campaign signs in their yards at election time tend to leave them up longer after Election Day if their candidate wins than if their candidate loses. People are less inclined to advertise their connections to losing teams and losing candidates because being associated with losers doesn't make as good of an impression. Basking in reflected glory is a pretty indirect self-presentational tactic. After all, in most cases, having a connection with a noteworthy person or a successful sports team usually doesn't say much about a person's personal characteristics. But research suggests that basking does work. Advertising these kinds of connections can affect other people's impressions of us. The psychological study of self-presentation emerged, in part, from the dramaturgical perspective in sociology. The dramaturgical perspective is based on the idea that aspects of people's everyday lives resemble a theatrical performance. It's a bit like Shakespeare's line, that all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. We don't want to take the dramaturgical metaphor too far. Life is not exactly like a very long play. But certain features of self-presentation do have dramaturgical features. We've already talked about people wearing clothes that are appropriate for the role they're in, which is much like actors wearing costumes that help them play a particular role on stage. A few other aspects of self-presentation also have a dramaturgical quality. First, just as theatrical productions use carefully designed sets on stage, people sometimes use aspects of their physical setting to influence other people's impressions of them. Consider how you furnish and decorate your home, whether you live in an apartment, a house, a single room, wherever. Well, now, obviously, some choices that you make about your furniture and decor reflect your personal tastes, your finances, and whether you own your own home, none of which involve self-presentation. But some of those choices might also reflect how you want your living space to look to other people, and the inferences they might draw about you based on how your home looks. If you're thinking, "No way, I don't care what impression other people form of me based on how my home looks," well, you might be right. But let me ask you this. If you know that company is coming, do you do anything at all to change the appearance of your home? Do you straighten it up a little? Vacuum or sweep the floor? Put certain things out of sight? Anything? You clearly aren't doing those things just for yourself because you didn't bother until someone else was coming over. You do them because of what other people would think of you if you didn't. The same is true for people who have their own office or cubicle or work area at work. If you have your own workspace, is there anything about how you have arranged or decorated that space that is more to convey an impression of you than for your own personal pleasure or satisfaction? I'm sometimes taken aback when I walk into a doctor's or dentist's or college professor's office and see all kinds of diplomas and certificates hanging on the wall. It's clearly self-presentational decor. And what about the objects that you have sitting out? Think about the knickknacks, photographs, books, magazines, and other things that you have sitting around your home or workspace for anyone to see. You own a lot of things that you could set out at home or at work. Are the things you've displayed a random selection of all of the things you own? Or are some of those things sitting out because they convey some desired impression, whatever that might be? Some of those objects in your home or office might be self-presentational props. And some of the self-presentational props that people use are portable. They carry them around, just like props in a play. I'm often struck by the self-presentational aspects of the wide variety of briefcases, backpacks, and bags that people use to carry their stuff to work or school. Whether you carry a leather briefcase or a messenger bag slung over your shoulder, or a padded backpack with lots of pockets, or a tattered canvas bag, each conveys a different impression of you. Functionality aside, there's no question that people's choices of what to carry their work in is partly determined by the impression that a particular briefcase, backpack, or bag will convey about them to other people. In describing ways in which people manage their impressions, I've been using examples of self-presentational tactics that people use in face-to-face interactions. So let me say a word about how these tactics play out online. People's behavior on social media obviously has a big self-presentational component. In fact, people join social networking sites in part to present information about themselves and their lives for other people to see. And even when they're doing other things online, writing blogs, giving advice, sharing their skills, or whatever, people manage their impressions using the same sorts of tactics they use in actual social interactions. People obviously manage impressions of their physical appearance online through their photographs and video clips they post of themselves. People select the photos and videos they post in part to convey certain impressions of their appearance, activities, and personal characteristics. And they sometimes digitally modify those images to enhance their appearance. You can think of that as digital cosmetic surgery. And as in face-to-face interactions, people use nonverbal behaviors online, choosing avatars to convey images of themselves, and picking emoticons and emojis to express their reactions. People also present images of themselves verbally as they describe their characteristics, experiences, beliefs, attitudes, and lists of favorite songs, movies, brands of clothing, and so on. In addition, they convey impressions of themselves by how they react to other users, by what they like and repost. And as you may expect, people also bask in reflected glory online, highlighting their connections to other people, groups, and yes, even sports teams. Likewise, people use settings and props online, or at least photographs of settings and props, as they show other people pictures of their living situation, their possessions, their pets, their meals. Online self-presentation does differ from face-to-face self-presentation in certain ways. For example, it's more difficult to present different images of yourself to different people online, but it's easier to misrepresent yourself online without getting caught. Nevertheless, the basic self-presentational tactics that people use online are mostly the same as they use in ordinary life. We'll talk more about this in a later lecture. In this lecture, I've tried to show you the variety of tactics that people use to influence other people's impressions of them through their appearance, nonverbal behaviors, things they disclose about themselves, the stories they tell, the attitudes they express, their connections with other people, how they describe and decorate their homes and workspaces, the props they use, and so on. Remember that almost any behavior can be used to convey an impression in a particular situation. Of course, these tactics are not always successful, and they can backfire. We'll be taking a look at self-presentational failures later in the course. But before we investigate that, we're going to turn our attention to the ways we use self-presentation to try to fit in and to help us play all of the roles that we play in life.